Hard to believe, but children as young as 6 are walking into therapy rooms. I have witnessed many cultural and social shifts in the narratives, certainly that shaped childhood, but few have concerned me as deeply as the rise in climate-related anxiety among children. I am in the room with children and I see how the messages that they are receiving are landing, how these ideas are showing up in young minds, and how they are affecting emotional development and psychological functioning, and ultimately kids' mental health.
Welcome to this special IPA Kemp Society event. I'm Deborah Henderson. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the IPA with responsibility for fundraising and development. Thank you to all the IPA members who've joined us from across Australia. For those who don't know what the Kemp Society is, this is our Bequest Society. It's our programme to thank those of you who have committed to leave a gift in your will to the IPA, and this is our way of thanking you in your lifetime by running small events, which we've been doing in all the major capital cities for the past year. And it occurred to us that so many of you are living outside of the capital cities or unable to attend our events, that we should really include you with this kind of online event so that you could hear from the research we're doing here at the IPA. And I've got two incredible researchers here with me today. We've got Colleen Harkin, who's the National Manager of the IPA Schools Programme, which was previously known as Class Action. And we've also got Clare Rowe, who's a practicing psychologist and adjunct fellow of the IPA. She is responsible for our climate anxiety in children programme, which you'll hear about today. The way we're going to run the next hour, and we do want to keep it as informal as possible, is that Colleen will say a few words and give you an overview of what we're doing here. And then we'll get Clare to present her research. Then we'll have a discussion, and we'd encourage you all to send in your questions on the chat function. I've certainly got a lot of them that have been sent in already, and we'll discuss those. So let's get underway. Colleen Harkin joined the IPA in 2023. She's a former teacher, educational consultant, and a political staffer. She now runs our schools programme. Over to you, Colleen.
Thanks, Deb. The Institute of Public Affairs has long been at the forefront of championing education reform, exposing and pushing back against the radical left-wing politicisation and ideological influences that are embedded in the national curriculum that distort history and weaken academic standards. We've clearly and consistently said that there's no place for this in Australian classrooms and it must be stopped. We've sounded the alarm on the disturbing collapse in student proficiency and have consistently called for the return to evidence-based teaching methods, the methods that we know work. We stand apart as the leading voice fighting for critical thinking, intellectual freedom and historical integrity, responsible citizenship and national pride in our education system. Amongst a range of objectives and activities, our schools program provides teachers with free resources that they can be confident provide factual, balanced material that celebrates Australia's heritage and democratic values while also fostering a spirit of inquiry and open debate. By equipping teachers with the right tools, we not only improve classroom experience, but we help ensure that the next generation of Australians learn that we are a country to be proud of. Our teaching resources have reached thousands of students. You may have seen the IPA's first Fleet Will You Survive board game, and thanks to the generous support of our donors, it has been distributed to every primary school across the country for free. We've received hundreds of requests from schools for extra copies of the game and the expansion pack, as well as downloads of the accompanying teacher resource, The Great Journey. The game is now available to the general public for purchase. Today, though, I want to focus briefly on one component of the national curriculum, which is the sustainability cross-curriculum priority. Taken at face value, the idea of sustainability might seem unobjectionable. Of course, we want children to understand the importance of caring for our environment. However, this is not what's happening. The Australian National Curriculum goes above and beyond, openly declaring its activist ambitions, and it specifically states The Sustainability Cross-Curriculum Priority is designed to raise student awareness about informed action to create a more environmentally and socially just world. There is no ambiguity here. It instructs young people to require the knowledge and skills to engage with issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, equitable access to resources, and that the students are to spend time examining the scientific consensus supporting global warming. The curriculum asks students to examine why there are different climate change models used by scientists when there is climate change consensus among scientists. The very principles of scientific inquiry have been abandoned, and it replaces questioning with conformity and teaches consensus rather than curiosity. The activism, catastrophisation and fear of climate change in the curriculum is relentless and unavoidable. Seemingly unrelated subjects like maths, art, music, physical education, even 5-year-old prep children are being inculcated into the culture of climate activism, while their parents are kept largely in the dark. It's no surprise then that children are feeling the weight of the world on their young shoulders, and we now have an epidemic of young people suffering from climate anxiety. While climate change is widely acknowledged as a complex issue, the practice of teaching distressing, politicised content to children as young as 5 has gone unchallenged. And that's why I'm very proud today to introduce the new IPA initiative, the Childhood Climate Anxiety Project, our dedicated research project examining the psychological toll that the current approach to climate education is having on young Australians. I lead this initiative alongside an outstanding team, IPA Senior Fellow Dr. Kevin Yeo, Research Fellow Margaret Chambers, and IPA Adjunct Fellow and Child Psychologist Clare Rowe. While almost everyone now acknowledges that climate anxiety is real and rising among children, our project is possibly a world first and certainly an Australian first in investigating a major, largely ignored contributor, the national curriculum itself. The very structure of the national curriculum, particularly the sustainability cross-curriculum priority, exposes children to developmentally inappropriate content, undermines their emotional well-being, and displaces essential learning in literacy and numeracy. This is a conversation that no one else is willing to have. Too many presume that climate anxiety is an unfortunate side effect of global challenges. We argue it's being fueled, if not manufactured, within the classroom. Our inaugural paper presents compelling evidence that emotionally charged, fear-based and age-inappropriate climate messaging is contributing to unnecessary psychological distress in primary age students. Our goal is not to debate the science of climate change. It is to safeguard the sanctity of childhood and protect young minds from information they cannot yet rationally or emotionally process. Our team will investigate content providers, policymakers and educational authorities, calling on them to cease and desist from distributing age-inappropriate, ideologically driven and psychologically harmful material to children. So on that note, may I introduce you to our Adjunct Fellow, Clare Rowe.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us for this special online event. Thank you to Deb and Colleen. Well, for the past 20 years, I have been working clinically with children and families as a psychologist in practice. I've been seeing families with a broad range of emotional and behavioural issues. And in that time, I have witnessed many cultural and social shifts in the narratives, certainly that shaped childhood, and as you can imagine, also shaped parenting and education. But few have concerned me as deeply as the rise in climate-related anxiety among children, but particularly those of the ages of 5 years plus. So we're not even talking teenagers here. And much important work is being done at the curriculum and policy level, including, as you've heard by my colleagues here at the IPA. My role is very different, and I speak not to you as a policy expert, but as a clinician. I am in the room with children and I see how the messages that they are receiving are landing. And so what I'd like to talk to you today about is my research at the IPA, but also my experience and my clinical lens, how these ideas are showing up in young minds and how they are affecting emotional development and psychological functioning and ultimately kids' mental health. So, hard to believe, but children as young as 6 are walking into therapy rooms, including my own, saying things like, I'm not going to grow up because the world is not going to exist and the planet is going to die. And as you can imagine, that is terrifying for a 6-year-old. I have met a little girl who was terrified to get into her family car because she believed that every single trip was contributing to the demise of the planet. I've seen a 10-year-old boy hoarding rubbish in his room to so-called save the planet. And these, unfortunately and sadly, are not isolated stories. I hear the same things from my psychology colleagues. They are part of an emerging clinical pattern, climate anxiety in primary school aged children. So clearly we are not talking here just about healthy environmental awareness. We're talking about a pathological anxiety, persistent and paralysing fear that interferes with these kids' everyday life and their ability to go to school and accomplish what they need to do every day. And as a clinician, I cannot stress this enough. Children are not cognitively or emotionally equipped to bear the weight of these global threats and ideologies. So, as a developmental psychologist, I want to talk to you for a minute about the brain. So, we're talking about children in primary school. So, as many of you have children in your life, you know between the ages of about 5 to 12 years old. They're in what psychologists call the concrete operational stage of cognitive development. So at this stage, children are really literal thinkers. What you say to them, they take literally and they think is going to happen. Just think about our stories about Santa Claus. They understand what they can see, what they can touch, and what they can experience. They do not grasp abstract ideas like long-term climate modelling, probabilities, or systemic global risks. So these are all concepts that we say require hypothetical reasoning, and in particular, they're really concepts in a higher order level of thinking that occur really at the front of the brain in what is known as the prefrontal cortex. Now, this area at the brain at the front is the very last thing to develop. In fact, our brains develop from the base at the back of the brain forward. We now know that a fully developed human brain is not actually at maturation until 25 years old. So that prefrontal cortex, the last to develop at the front of the brain there, is responsible for what we call executive functioning. So these are things like perspective taking, weighing up probabilities, and regulating fear. So in contrast, that back of the brain, the amygdala, that's our very primal area of the brain that develops first in utero. And that's the brain's emotional alarm bell, essentially. It is highly active in childhood and it reacts strongly to perceived threats, even if those threats are misunderstood or exaggerated. And so we know this. Kids react really strongly in a response to monsters under the bed, nightmares, and they can't often regulate that amygdala and that fear center of the brain. And it is our job as adults to step in and do that often for them. So when a 7-year-old sees a bushfire on the news and hears, "This is your future if we don't act," her amygdala will light up. But importantly, her prefrontal cortex is not ready to make sense of it. She feels fear, but she cannot contextualize or soothe it. And the result, a chronic state of alarm that lingers after the lesson ends. And that is how fear becomes anxiety. Now, I want to stress as a psychologist that in every other context, whether it's fear of war or illness or natural disaster, we do instinctively protect children. We limit their exposure, we offer them comfort, we let them know that the adults have it, you're safe, it's okay. But with climate change, we seem to have abandoned this instinct entirely. And instead of reassurance, we deliver urgency. Instead of perspective, we deliver panic. And then we praise the child for caring. And I would argue the child is not caring, they're overwhelmed. So as Colleen has said previously, the Australian National Curriculum now embeds climate change content from the age of 5 years old. These are kids who can't tie up their shoelaces, and it is across all subjects and all learning areas. But importantly, no safeguards are in place to ensure that this content is developmentally appropriate. Children are exposed to concepts such as global warming, mass extinction, environmental catastrophe, at an age where they cannot interpret nuance. We tell children in the classrooms things like, there is no planet B. But what does that mean to a literal-minded 7-year-old? It means their future is doomed, unless we act now. We show them images of floods and fires, and we tell them to take action. But really, the issue is, what action can a child realistically take? Okay, they could pick up their rubbish. Should they be going home and telling mum and dad that they must buy a new electric car? That we can't eat the steak for dinner because we have to reduce meat consumption? And what happens despite all these efforts by the child? They realise that the world still feels broken and there is a mismatch between their responsibility and their agency to be able to actually make a change. And that is not just frustrating for a child, it is a recipe for despair. It fosters what psychologists call learned helplessness. And that is the belief that nothing they do matters, and so why even try? And unfortunately, that is the children that I have been seeing increase in my clinical room over the last 5 years. Children who feel helpless and hopeless and feel that no one is listening to them, whether it be their parents or some of them quoting that the government is not listening to them and doesn't care about their future. I think another layer here also that I've outlined in my research paper is the moralising of environmental behaviour. So children are taught that certain actions are bad, using plastic straws, eating meat, driving the family petrol car, and that failing to act is some type of failing to act perfectly is a moral failing. I've heard children express guilt. I've heard children certainly put guilt onto other children for doing things like using plastic, and shame for things like forgetting to recycle correctly. And I don't think as a psychologist, guilt and shame are minor feelings. They are powerful emotional forces. And when they're introduced too early, they can certainly shape a child's identity. So my argument is that we are not raising responsible, engaged citizens. We're actually raising children who feel personally responsible for solving adult problems without the tools to do so. And the consequences are showing up, unfortunately, clinically. And we talk a lot about the mental health crisis with children. Not only have we got rising anxiety, but we've got disrupted sleep patterns, we've got fear of the future, withdrawal from everyday activities. And ironically, I have to say that even environmental disengagement with children can occur. So children that just present to me as so numb and detached and indifferent because this burden of a global problem for an 8-year-old feels so heavy. So when we overlay this emotional burden onto childhood, I'm really concerned that what we also do is interrupt normal developmental processes. I think we forget as adults that childhood is a time for rapid brain development on a daily basis. Thousands of neural connections being built every day. They're not just playing, they're not just finger painting. Their brain is constantly developing. Childhood should be full of play, imagination, movement, social connections. And I think we need to remember that these are not just luxuries to give kids a nice childhood. They are biological necessities. And when we overstimulate the fear circuits in children, particularly, as I mentioned before, that amygdala, we risk crowding out all of these experiences and interrupting normal development. And we've long known in developmental neuroscience that excessive exposure to adult concerns, particularly like this politically and emotionally charged ones, I think acts as a cognitive pollutant to the brain. It distracts it, it distorts it, it dysregulates the child. And in the case of climate anxiety, it does so under the banner of virtue. Now, just to finish off, what I've also outlaid in our initial report is a worrying fact that even my own profession, psychology, has not actually pushed back against this. Instead, many clinicians are told to affirm and even encourage children's climate anxiety. Unfortunately, our peak body, the Australian Psychological Society, offers resources on eco-grief and eco-trauma and urges validation over intervention to reduce the anxiety. The APS would argue that a child's anxiety responses are a very valid response to a global threat. Some psychologists now even propose that therapy should support environmental action. Certainly the APS's stance is that psychologists as behavioural experts are very well placed to assist their clients, including children, at channeling some of their fear into collective action, as they put it. But in no other area of clinical anxiety would this be acceptable. Imagine a child with a phobia of flying and being told, "You're right, you know what, planes are terrifying, let's just protest the airline industry." We would never do this. Yet with climate, we do it and we applaud it. So this is not about denying climate change or debating the climate change science. It's about asking whether our youngest children are developmentally ready to process it and whether our current approach is actually helping or seriously harming them. Because if we are serious about addressing the so-called mental health crisis with our young people, we must begin restoring these protective boundaries around what I say is the sanctity of childhood. Let them read, let them play, let them wonder, let them feel safe, and let them be held by adults around them and not burdened by some weight of global collapse. They do not need to be the next generation of young climate warriors. They just need to be children. And I think it's our job, all of us as parents, as grandparents, as concerned citizens, as clinicians, educators, researchers, to make sure that kids can just be kids. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to be able to share all that with you. And now I think we're going to open it up to the floor and have some questions, and I think probably some debate that I'm looking forward to.
We certainly are. Thanks, Claire. You can see how massively important this work is. And this is something you haven't just been doing for the IPA for the past month or so. You've been speaking about this for 10 years, and we're now giving you a greater platform. So thank you for all you've done to identify this. And certainly myself as a mother of 3 children who was horrified by what my kids were bringing home when they were little. And they're probably, as they're adults now, even more horrified, I have to say. But it's really important. I'm so proud that the IPA is doing this. So yes, we have got questions coming in, and I think I'll turn to you first of all, Colleen. We've got quite a few on the same sort of area. We've got Jeff from Oatley in New South Wales and Lachlan from Wembley Downs in WA who are pretty much asking the same question. How do we get teachers and principals to just stop pushing this agenda? Like, how can we pressure the schools to stop teaching this nonsense?
There's a couple of layers to it, Deb, because the schools often point the finger at the national curriculum, and they sort of use that referencing to say we have to do it because it's in the curriculum. But there are a lot of teachers out there who are uncomfortable in doing it and need the encouragement to say we actually don't want that. And there are schools who are trying to minimise the impact. And also it's incumbent on parents to let the schools know how they feel about it. Because unlike America, we don't have that situation where Americans have a direct contact into their school to decide the curriculum, but we certainly still have influence on what the school does. And so if parents are talking about this stuff and seeing what their children are coming home with, just speak to the teacher and say, where is this coming from? Is it appropriate for my child? There are third-party providers who go into schools and provide content to them, and they often do sort of what they call incursions, some of these things. Don't send your child, sort of take the position that you don't want your child to be exposed to this stuff. And that's the only way schools actually hear this, is by people speaking and taking some kind of action. So it's a double-edged sword, with both sides of the coin needing to have exposure on the conversation.
So when they're trying to turn our children into activists, we need to
we
be
become
activists,
the activists ourselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I often say to people that your child is not a ward of the state. They're your child and your responsibility and your privilege. So look after, your biggest gift.
And how do you deal with it in clinic? I mean, I presume it's the parents that you are really speaking to when the children are showing such distress.
Yeah, my clinic certainly emphasises that the evidence base for treating any anxiety with children, certainly under the age of 12, is to work with parents. So whilst we do meet children and we assess them in some initial stages, and we might talk to children about some perspective taking, and we might give them some reassurance or direct them to distract them away from the topic, we then really work with parents, because again, parents are there every day, 7 days a week, that it's their responsibility. And we might suggest to them, again, saying, trying to work out where it's come from, and have you seen anything about what they're doing at school? Because some parents come and say, I really don't know. It's not something we talk about at home, and we don't talk about climate around the dinner table. This is not an interest my husband and I or wife and I have taken. We really don't know. And so we start kind of looking at, getting more engaged with their schoolwork and what they're doing. And I think parents talking to each other at school too.
Yeah.
So I'm a mother, and I have had parents approach me and say, are you worried about this? Knowing what, I am a psychologist. And so you might put some feelers out and really get some camaraderie with other parents as well.
It's always difficult to do something by yourself.
Yeah.
That's always parents got to look and go, I don't want to be the troublemaker.
Yes.
But as soon as they open their mouth, you often find that there's someone else like, I think that too. I'm worried about that as well. And also looking at what they're bringing home from school, looking at the material, their worksheets, the colouring in things. You'd be surprised at how young this stuff starts, where they've got to colour in a map of the world with flames coming out of it. It's very young children who are doing art activities or something that is really quite alarming, and parents don't know about it, but they don't know to actually look. It's not the old days where they were just doing 3 hours and learning their times tables. There is, in most of the curriculum that they're doing, there's an undercurrent message that is going on.
Well, obviously we've got the report, which actually you can download on our website. This is the initial report, which is what Claire's just been outlining. But quite a few people are asking, where do you go from here? What's the next stage? You've identified the problem. What sort of research are you going to be able to do now in terms of taking this further?
We've got sort of a staged approach to this. The first Claire's paper on the actual psychological component of this. We're also looking at auditing the national curriculum itself and identifying quite specifically areas, subjects, activities that are recommended within the curriculum that is given to teachers to say, we recommend that you do this, and looking at the third-party providers, places like Behind the News on the ABC. For example, Claire and I have spoken a couple of times about where they'll run a program for kids, and at the start of it they'll say, trigger warning, there's information in here that might upset you, and then they go ahead and show it. So they know that it's really potentially upsetting and damaging, but they do it anyway. There are organisations like cool.org that have this, they've only got 3 areas of their program, and a lot of it's about sustainability, and a lot of schools use their material. So we'll be doing an analysis of the stuff that is going into schools, what kind of content is being provided by these NGOs, how many people are using, we're just sort of doing an analysis, unpicking it all as we go. And the big issue for us is providing oxygen and light on it, because parents don't really know what's going on. So unless we can sort of shine a light on they drop the child off at school in all good faith and think that they're having a great time, but what is actually going on between 9 and 3:30.
And Martin from Gorton in ACT asked a really good question. I mean, what can non-government schools do anything different to government schools? Is there a disparity in what they're allowed to teach or what action can be
schools
taken?
it's a really good question, Deb, because there's a lot of this finger pointing that goes on, and schools have a lot more scope than they pretend that they do. Some of them are ideologically committed to it, that if you want to send your child to that school, that's up to you. But a lot of them are doing it because they feel that they need to. And this is where the feedback is really important. So schools have the opportunity to absolutely minimise the content and or present it in a different way. Some of the stuff that we do in the schools program absolutely aligns with the national curriculum, but it's not doing it in an ideological activist way. We're sort of giving them the balanced material. And I'll give you a simple example that I've used lots is that for young children doing grammar, you could do an activity about the children are sitting at the table, or you could do an activity saying the whales are dying. And so you're actually teaching the same grammatical lesson, but one of them has a inculcating message in it, and one of them is a simple grammar lesson. So a lot of it is up to schools and parents to start to have that conversation about, I want my child to learn grammar, but they don't need to talk about fires and dying animals.
Doesn't that speak to really the heart of one of the biggest issues here that I didn't even realise as a clinician in coming into the IPA and working with Colleen, that I just don't think that most parents would know that this topic of sustainability, aka climate, is mandated in every subject area. And so you have to teach it in the English grammar lessons, in the sport lessons, in the music lessons, it is not restricted to science or society or environmental studies. And so that's really at the heart of the problem, isn't it? And that's why they're teaching it as an exercise in grammar, because they think, I can do the sustainability piece and I can teach grammar at the same time. And so really what we want ultimately is to get rid of this cross-curriculum priority.
Correct.
That we shouldn't be teaching this in maths lessons.
Yeah. So there are things like, say, for example, in dance or music, children will have to do something like make up a climate change, something about the climate.
Like a rap song about climate change. Yeah.
So that's how they sort of infiltrate every subject at every year level. To your point about what to do about it, and our big picture item is remove the cross-curriculum priority of sustainability and reinstate subject integrity. That would be the big ticket item. Unfortunately, and it's not that simple to do, because that requires the education department to do that. So we're not allowed to. We don't lobby. We disseminate our research aggressively. So they are conversations that we have, but that's a long-term object, because it's just not going to happen overnight. So there is 1,000 things that we can all do while we're reaching towards that big game.
And that's what Michael from, I think it says from New South Wales, has said, is there any way that we can educate and explain this to politicians on both sides of politics? I mean, that is our role.
Yeah. It is a part of our role, most definitely. The other thing is that what we do is provide some of the alternative material and go looking for books and things. We spoke about activities that teachers give their students. So Claire and I were just talking before about a persuasive language activity where students are asked to write a persuasive thing, and the person was to model on Greta Thunberg, right?
I had a mother send me this only 2 days ago, just a concerned mum, saw what we were doing here, sent me a photo example of her 10-year-old. So year 5, 10 years old, they had been told, write a persuasive writing piece to the school or the government, I can't remember which one it was, speaking about the importance of acting on climate change, and use Greta Thunberg as your inspiration. And it's very confronting to see it in child's handwriting, that my planet is dying, I will die, you need to help us. It's just heartbreaking.
And that modelling of who the person they're putting up on a pedestal as well, like a girl who's crying telling them that we are going to die, the house is on fire, sort of thing. And at grades sort of 5 or 6, which is 10 or 12-year-old students, being encouraged to write to the Prime Minister to tell them that you are making us die. And then that's the activist component in this. And of course, the Prime Minister's not going to reply to their letter, and then they interpret that as he doesn't care. So there's this sort of cycle that keeps working through, that the pressure on the kids is that you are going to die and you need to do something about it. And of course they can't. And whether they're even going to die or not is never even addressed. It's just assumed that all of this is how we should be going.
And you raise a point there, which is where you guys can help, because you do see this material. Do send it through to Colleen and Clare. We are collating it. It will form part of the research we do. Children, obviously, probably in the main, aren't being referred to you because they have climate anxiety as the first point of call. You must be uncovering this in your sessions. Are they generally being referred to you with anxiety, depression, parents being a little worried, and then you're peeling back the surface and this is what you're finding?
Yeah, most kids, when they get referred, it's usually from some observed difficulty in their behaviour or sleep that parents notice first. So they might be referred because they can't fall asleep at night, and they've been through medical checks and everything seems fine, so it's deemed to be psychological, or they're becoming more withdrawn or behaviourally disruptive or teary. And so yes, we've had a couple of kids that have explicitly been referred for climate anxiety, but that usually comes up in sessions, literally with 9-year-olds kind of welling up in tears saying, we learnt about these things. And sometimes they do just say, we learnt about this at school. And so it's uncovered in the process of that. And like most psychological or mental health presentations, that is much easier to address as a preventative measure than once we've got a kid who is clinically anxious. And so, again, I think a huge part of this project for me is about awareness and education to parents, that even if your child seems fine, I still want you engaged with the work that they're getting. Because a lot of parents might say, oh, I know, but my child seems fine. And that's, thank goodness my children, myself, are fine and seem fine, but I want to be over the work they're doing. And letting parents know, like you said, Colleen, before, that they can opt out of things. So even if it wasn't an incursion, even if it was something directed to, I want you to write this persuasive writing piece, or for younger children, colour in this picture. And if you're seeing that come home and feel uncomfortable, you do have a right to say, I don't want my child to partake in that activity. Can they be given something alternatively, or, and have that discussion. That is your right as a parent. And I think that you should do that even with psychologically healthy children to prevent the children that I see in my clinic.
And that's where the talking to other parents is really helpful, because if a couple of parents in the class just say, listen, that worksheet was a bit, we're a bit uncomfortable with that. You don't have to be aggressive about it. It's not hard for a teacher to change that worksheet to something else. But the teacher doesn't usually, teachers got a lot on their plate, but if they're getting the feedback that the parents are uncomfortable with that, they will change it.
This is quite shocking. This is Janice, who's watching online, who said, the Uniting Church of Australia is having a climate emergency day in their schools for grades 6 to 8. I was appalled when I read this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Climate
and
emergency.
so,
even that word emergency.
Right?
This is an emergency.
That's the thing, is that the immediate pressure that you have to do something about it, because otherwise you're going to die. What does that do to a young child?
And why not just have an environmental day? That's okay. We can have an environmental day where we learn about taking care of one's immediate environment and not littering and saving water. That's kind of the initiatives I remember back in school, and I don't have a problem with that. But yeah, we teach very young children about 000 emergency number, emergency alarms, and practicing that at school. And so the word emergency is only ever linked to these emergencies. We teach that from a very young age. That is an emergency. So to use that word connected with the planet and environment is...
The other thing that we haven't spoken about yet is using that sort of climate change emergency assumes that there is one. So the kids are never taught the idea to critically assess information. So at this age, they're being inculcated to this warrior lifestyle, if I can call it that, and they're never really in a position to sort of say, well, hang on a minute, is it actually happening, and is it an emergency? And they don't have the academic skill set to critique the information, because while all of this is going on, their academic skills are declining. So their math skills, their reading skills, their comprehension skills, all of this stuff, there's all the evidence to show that the average 15-year-old in Australia is now about a year and a half behind where they were 20 years ago. And by the time they've gone through a primary school indoctrination of all of this material, and they don't have the academic skills to interrogate it, by the time they do get to be a sort of a young teenager, everything about it has already been formed for them.
Emotionally too. It's
emotionally,
so
and academically, yeah.
And that actually, someone online has just talked about Aero recently reporting that year 9 students are writing at primary school levels.
And that's correct. And for example, like year 9 punctuation is around about a 9-year-old's. Our grade 3s in Australia, about a third of the nation's grade 3s don't meet minimum benchmark for reading and writing. So anyone with like a teaching or an education background will tell you, once a child falls behind, it's very difficult for them to catch up. Not impossible, but very difficult. And so these years of foundational skills development are critical. And instead of, talking about climate change and worrying about another country's social justice under climate change, that we really need to focus on making sure that they can read and write.
And that's the thing, Deb, that we say, and as I've engaged with people in the public about this issue, is that there are certain people who would say that children need to be aware that climate change is a real threat if that's what they believe. But the fact of the matter is even if you did accept the facts of climate change and global warming, you're not actually raising children to go and solve that issue. You are raising children who are paralysed. If you do not think you're going to live past the age of 20, why would you be motivated to solve the issue when you're an adult? And so even if, this really should appeal to both sides of the argument of climate change, because, if we want children to grow up to be the brilliant scientists and intellectual minds that are going to invent the accommodations for the planet and invent how we're going to thrive on planet Earth, we're not doing that. We have children paralysed, hopeless, helpless, rocking in the corner, thinking there's no point. They don't want to grow up. They don't have aspirations. They certainly don't want to have children in the future. Yeah. And so, this should concern everyone.
Yeah, that Lancet, there was a Lancet study in 2021 that said about 75% of young adults 16 to 24 think that climate change and they're worrying about climate change, anxiety is the forefront of their mind every single day. And about 68% of them or so are saying that they don't want to have children because they're so concerned about the future, that there isn't a future. I mean, if you're a 20-year-old, you should be out sort of...
The world is your oyster.
Correct, right?
That's the prime of your life, right?
It all goes downhill after that. Should be doing all those things that you don't want anyone to know that you did.
And you do. And at 20, for a lot of females, I mean, not every female, but, you think, I'm going to be married by this time, I'm going to have kids by this time. It's part of your plan as well as your career, and it's in there. But yes, a lot of young people are very despondent about the future.
And so to have that weight on your shoulder that, like, there's nothing to look forward to, it's all depressing and demoralising and it's shocking.
And then we question why we have a mental health crisis with young people. Yeah. It's quite obvious.
Yeah. Richard from Ivanhoe actually was asking the question that I was about to ask on this. Is there a gendered bias with this? Are the children that are most at risk of suffering anxiety in this, are they girls? Are girls at more risk than boys, are you finding?
Well, I'd start by saying that there are children who are clearly going to be more vulnerable to picking up this information and ruminating on it than others, okay? So we're not talking about, worksheets go out and every single child is going to have clinical anxiety, okay? I often say I've got 2 kids. One would be far more susceptible to ruminating on this and coming home and quoting facts and saying, Mum, the polar bears are dying and I'm worried. And the other kid is worrying about when he can kick his football. Like, he's not listening, he doesn't mind, that's fine. So it certainly is about temperament and personality there to have a vulnerability. When we're talking about younger children, I do think, and particularly I have to say into teenage years as well, that there is a propensity for girls to internalise, we say, rather than have externalising problems. So stereotypically, boys have externalising problems where they might have more behavioural things going on, but girls internalise. That means they ruminate on problems and they worry more. So there is a gender bias, I think, anecdotally speaking, that girls are a little bit more at risk, though I have seen boys as well. But I'd say I have seen more girls.
Can I just, I'm clearly not a psychologist, but to me that's sort of part of the scenario of being close to your children and talking to them. Because if the kids are getting, if school is giving them a whole lot of stuff and they are worried about it, if you're close to what's going on and you can talk to your child and you can say, for example, the polar bears, honey, they'll be okay. And you can sort of calm them in that. If you don't know what's going on, you can't speak about it. But the ability to give them an alternative is really important as a parent, I think.
Going straight back to the beginning, Gerald from Barrel asked a question, how's this happened, Colleen? How have we got to the state that children are being indoctrinated like this in our schools? I could answer this.
It's the biggest question ever. Look, I mean, there is, some people call it the slow march through the institutions, and it has been going on for a couple of decades. And piece by piece, things are being deconstructed and reconstructed in a way with an agenda that is less than helpful. And so the national curriculum was installed about, let's say 15 years ago, and it has been inculcated into that piece by piece, and it grew. It wasn't initially in every subject, but it's grown through. And to be honest, it's the activists in the political class that have allowed it to get in there and stay in there. And both sides of politics are guilty of this because the coalition was in government for 9 years and they had an opportunity to do something about it and didn't. So everybody points the finger at each other. It is a big problem to be able to unpick. But, our ambition here is to do both sides of the fence, to try and deal with the big ticket items with the bureaucracy and the Department of Education and the ministers and all that sort of stuff, but also a grassroots program where people, parents, teachers, grandparents, children themselves, I've got a son who's about to turn 21, and when this sort of stuff comes up, he just rolls his eyes. So, fortunately, he's one of those kids who's a bit more resilient and will not care, you know what I mean? But he has, particularly some of the young females that he knows are really quite concerned about it. But, them too, getting them to be part of the conversation about, we're all going to be okay.
Yeah, I promised my 15-year-old daughter I would not discuss her in this thing. Both boys work at the IPA, so you can see how I'm going on this front. But
that's the difference too, even at that age, between male and females, right? Females stereotypically are more empathetic, and we know that, and they will form opinions on topics and vote very emotionally led. Yeah. And so they are prime targets for this, coming right through teenage years.
Yeah. The other thing that we haven't discussed is the social justice component of this climate change agenda, because I think that's a lot of what appeals to the girls.
Yes.
That what they're talking about is we need a socially just world. And so this climate issue is tied up with looking after other people. And so their global perspective is that, you're privileged because you're living in this wonderful place. And so other people have, islands that are going to be consumed by water, or they don't have water, or, there's something that climate's doing. Or places where there are bushfires that have no relevance to their life as an 8-year-old, but they're made to feel that somehow they can help and be responsible for that.
Yes, and certain children are very vulnerable to that, in feeling like they need to. And
they
we
need
just
to
know
help
the differences
somehow.
in children and personalities as adults,
There's obviously, it's very sad that we've got to this stage that we're having to do research to show how much we're harming our children. And we've only got another 10 minutes left of this webinar. There's a lot of people saying, but seriously, what can we do at this stage? I mean, you've held up some of the national curriculum that we've printed. It is a lot to unwind. My point would be, in answer to that, would be that the IPA is a megaphone for research. We haven't talked about this before. This is such early stage. The report's only just been published. Claire's been with us only a couple of months. We'll see success when it changes. This is an everyday thing that people are talking about in the narrative, in politics, in the media, in a lot the same way as the migration and housing crisis. That when people start talking about this and they don't mention the IPA, then we're really having an impact.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, yes, it's up to us all, but we really are very grateful to have Clare on staff and to actually be able to get our fingers into this and really, you know, the next report. What is the next report?
An analysis of the actual curriculum and citing what they call the curriculum markers and how prolific it is in there, and who the providers are who are providing some of those worksheets and things that teachers use.
Do you find we've got a big teachers network associated with the IPA. What are they saying about this?
Look, the average teacher that I've ever met just wants to do the right thing. You know, they're good people trying to do a good job, and there's a high proportion of them who are very worried about what they're being asked to do and how much they're being asked to do. And then some of them are just, they don't actually know. One of the issues here is that, for example, if you teach grade 2, you don't helicopter up and see the whole curriculum. So you're doing your job in grade 2 and you're talking about, you know, koalas or bushfires or whatever, and you're not really cognizant that that's happening in grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, because you're just doing your job. And so there aren't very many people who have this bird's eye view, which is why this research and our audit of the curriculum is actually really important, because it exposes the fact that it's not just in grade 2 and it's not just in art or music, it's in all of these subjects at every year level. And it's like a dripping tap. That is constantly, I mean, a child would have something of a climate change every day, without doubt. They'd have something, a worksheet or a song or a book or a conversation. There would be something every day of their life.
It's depressing thinking about that. You know, like how could they possibly be optimistic and happy if it's every day?
Well, I mean, the people who sit on the other side of this fence would say that they are empowering the students, right? That would be their argument, that it is a big problem and they need to know how to fix it. But there is no recognition that these children are way too young and they don't have the skill set to cope with it. And even I would even argue, even at the age of 15 or 16, you might sort of have the conversation academically with them, not emotionally. But they've got to have the skill set
in science lesson or in
right,
an
but they've got to have the
appropriate
skill
lesson.
set to understand the maths and the data and the economics
As
and
you
everything
said, what
else.
an average is.
Yeah,
You know,
like most of them don't know what an average is. So how can they talk about average sea rising levels?
Yeah.
Now, Clare, you're probably way too young to answer this, and
I know
Colleen,
you're not asking me.
Colleen, you're not a psychologist, but let's give it a go. So Ashley has asked, have psychologists noticed a direct correlation in the timing of when children began presenting with these anxiety issues and the implementation of the national curriculum 15 years ago?
Well, I mean, I've been working with kids for 20 years, so I might just look a bit younger, but I don't know. But I would say that there has been a rapid spike in the last 5. Prior to the last 5 years, I would see kids every now and then. They would be an abnormality, but they were there. They've been there for the last 8 years presenting, but a spike in the last even 3 to 4. It's become more commonplace. And I have a clinic with 5 other psychologists there, and it more regularly comes up over our clinical meetings and over the lunch table or the staff table to say, you know, I had this 9-year-old in tears about this, or I didn't know what to say when this 6-year-old was worried about ice caps melting and said that the teacher had told them this. And that's something that we had discussed earlier, is that it's also very hard for, and I'm sure people listening to this would agree, that when a child comes home, I know from my children, and they say, Mrs. Whoever told me this, Mum. Yeah, Mum knows nothing. Mum might as well and there is a lot of authority, and that's for good reason, placed in teachers, and that's not all bad. But I tell you what, if I challenge my children's teacher on something very innocuous, I am met with a bit of resistance from my kids saying, oh no, but the teacher said.
That happens very early too, as soon as they enter prep. The kids, you know, that you don't know anything anymore. Yeah. This is the all-powerful person here and they know everything. Yeah. So you instantly sort of fall in. And that's why the continuing conversations are important, to kind of keep that balance.
Yeah, and I just think I know people really want to know what to do. And I would just summarise it by saying, that they need to be engaged with their children's work. They need to be looking at the worksheets. They need to be attending the open days where they take you around the classroom and you can have a bit of a flip through and look at things. You need to talk to other parents if you're concerned, even if it was one or two. And again, it doesn't have to be combative. It can be in a very, calm manner. If you'd like to, share the report, download the report and share it and send it to a teacher or a school. And there's a summary on the front page. They don't have to read the whole report, right? It's a summary. You could just send that and say, oh, I just read this. What do you think? Because we're going to get that grassroots movement happening if we can increase the conversation.
The other thing is for people who are a bit more activist-minded, post on social media.
Yes.
Just sort of say, this. Look at this. This is what my child was asked to do at school today. You'd be amazed at how many people go, yeah, that's not okay. And it's like everything else. If you feel like you're not the only person in the room, it gives people that level of confidence to have a chat with other people. And that, again, that's the scenario where teachers and schools get the feedback to say, maybe we don't need to be doing this as aggressively as we're doing it. We can pull back a bit. There are schools who are genuinely trying to minimise this as much as possible, and they are looking at sort of their liberal education and looking at Western civilisation values, and they're sort of turning it on its head and focused on good classic education. So there are schools who are doing it. It can be done.
And what about to the children themselves? What should they be saying? What should parents, when the children are actually showing this level of distress? Because you normally validate your child's distress. This is something, you say, no, you'll be okay. No, you're right. I know. How do you deal with that when the child is actually a ball of worry?
I think if we're dealing with primary school age children and we're dealing with 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, just coming back to that teacher authority, it's very difficult if a child hears something from one environment and then comes home and parents or grandparents say, no, that's not right. Here are different facts. And I've likened it akin to kind of divorced parents, and mum says one thing and dad says the other. And just presenting more facts and opposing facts doesn't really help the child at that age. They just get more confused. So my approach would be, you can still validate a child's feeling by saying, gosh, that must have been really worrying when you heard that. I can understand that would make you feel worried. So that's letting the child know that you've heard them. But by then saying, there are some really smart adults who are onto this, and adults are taking care of that problem, and you don't really need to think or worry about that. We're going to be fine, and you can tell kids that. But going in and arguing with a 7-year-old about, well, it's not, the facts of climate change aren't being presented to you, and here we go, and that's not true, and the teacher's lying, I think will actually potentially increase anxiety with a young child. I think if you're talking about a 16-year-old plus, I think that's very different. We can have different conversations and fact-based conversations and alternative fact-based conversations. But with young children, we can validate by saying, gosh, that I can understand why, you don't want to see the polar bears die. However, that is not an issue you need to deal with because it's being dealt with. There are adults all over that and scientists and the most brilliant minds in the world, and that is not for you to worry about because you need to be a kid.
Yeah, go and finger paint, go and get dirty.
Climb the tree, break your leg.
Get off your phone.
Yeah, off your phone, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Colleen. Thanks, Claire. That was a really stimulating discussion. Thank you, everyone online, for your questions. That brings us to the end of this discussion as we approach the top of the hour. I hope we've given you some hope and you're not too depressed by this whole thing, but I hope you know that we have identified it. Claire has been, a force of nature on this for some time, and we're backing her up, and we are going to be doing a lot more on this. So please download the report. Give us your feedback on today as well. We are only just starting the programme. There will be more to come. For those of you who would like more information on the Kemp Society, feel free to get in touch with me via the website. But really, we just want to thank you for being part of the movement that the IPA is, 10,000 members who stand up for what we all stand for and for Australian values, and for just making the place a better place for our children, grandchildren, and putting an end to all this nonsense that's making life so difficult for our little ones. So thank you for coming today, and look forward to hosting one of these again in the near future. Thank you.